Hello, this is Dr. Schemberger, and in this brief talk, we're going to start with our journey of education news. We've got to figure out, how did education news start? But I hate to disappoint. The history of education news is not complete, but we do know some nuggets to share that can help us determine what we need to do from here. So let's get started. So what I'm hoping that by the end of this module that you'll be able to do, and that this lecture is going to help you to do as well, is that you'll be able to describe the presence of education news in early to mid 20th century newspapers, and that you'll be able to trace education news reporting as an issue-oriented news beat throughout the mid to the late 20th century newspapers to kind of see where we are today. These two module objectives are going to help you meet the course level objective, in which I'm wanting you to have this broad goal by the end of the course to be able to discuss historical moments in the development of education news. So much of what we know about education, as far as really trying to determine where we can find its presence, is in columns, newspaper columns. We would know that many journalists, many reporters would write columns, and they might focus on something that was going on in the schools, or they might talk about a little topic that is pertinent to education at that time. But we would also see a great presence of education in advertising. Newspapers really caught on to how important education was. Look at the example to your right. You will see a news page from 1918, the Bismarck Evening Tribune in North Dakota. And here they would use education as a good reason for families to subscribe to their paper. If you want your child basically educated, if you want them to learn to read and you want them to read well, you start with newspapers. So it even said the best aid to the child's education is reading the newspapers. And the Tribune is clean, a clean paper for your home. Subscribe now. So this was a good indication of how we would see education being a kind of a way to play in advertising. We would also see education prominently covered just in school news. These kinds of school news, though, would be buried more on the inside pages, because these school news came from mostly student education, or excuse me, student election results, maybe club events and activities, things along those lines. Anything that gave the opportunity for a student, to see his or her name in print. And so newspapers would carry those types of pieces. Many times schools would supply that information. Here is another example of an ad campaign in which it focused on education. But really what's significant about this particular ad campaign, which came from the New York Sun and the New York World, both newspapers being owned by the same company at this time, is that Tristram Walker Metcalf might be the first education news journalist that we know. Not many journalists in this part of the early 20th century basically, when we're talking about education, we don't know too many of them. Many journalists we know because they wrote maybe some really good columns. They were prominent column writers. Dorothy Dix might be a good example of that. But we also know of reporters who really did a good job in covering war. So that was their focus. And there's plenty of scholarship on those profiles of those journalists, but there's not much about education journalists, about specific education journalists. So Tristram might be the first one that we know of. Education pages also had a growing presence in the newspapers. Albert Shanker, who was president of the American Federation of Teachers, he was quoted as saying that, especially when education pages started to really appear in the newspapers, he even remembered how every school bought a copy. At least a third of the teachers bought one. The page would be clipped and also posted on school bulletin boards all across the city. So it became a forum for school people. And newspapers knew that. So they had this daily education page. Now, they didn't last for too long. Over time, then we would start to see them in the weekly pages. But nevertheless, there was still a role that education played as part of newspapers, whether it's for promotional or just somehow they had a life in newspapers. Now, we do see some focus on education news in the scholarship, so in journal articles. Now, many of these studies really focused on how well newspapers devoted to education news. A lot of these studies surfaced around the 60s. So some of these names you're probably going to see over and over. If you were to really study this, you would see this repeated in the literature reviews. But some of the things that I've selected here to kind of give you an idea as to how education has developed during this time. Gerbner in 1966 did this 5 decade, or did a study that spanned over 5 decades worth of newspapers. And what he found was that really of all the news space, only less than 4% was devoted to education, not a whole lot. And then also from the 50s into the 70s, content analysis became the large methodological tool that researchers would use to determine how much weight was given to education. So they wanted to see, when we talk about education, we also don't know really what they meant by that. Did that also include sports news? If they focused on a school team, so we really don't know what is meant by education. So the content analysis studies are going to maybe differ, but nevertheless, there are some themes that we can conclude from a number of these studies. Duncan also in 1966 then wanted to do a study of the educational beat to see, is it really a news beat that has been developed well? The reason why is because if you think about the early part of the 20th century, we were in and out. The country, the United States, was in and out of conflict often. So whenever we are in war, we might see less attention maybe placed on education, as Gerbner found in 1964. But when soldiers return from war, we're seeing two things. We're seeing them first, we're starting to see families grow. Okay, so the number of children is increasing. The second thing we're noticing also about soldiers, especially around in the post World War II era, is that many of them are going to school, namely colleges and universities. So education is on the rise among soldiers, especially anytime we have post-war activity. But even though we've got a great increase there in education, newspapers aren't supplying the kind of help that some of these journalists need. So we do have education reporters growing, but because their workload also is growing post-war, they're not given the assistance or any additional help to handle these large workloads. The bottom line is that education news is a product that the public wants. Okay? They really want to know what's going on in the schools. What are the issues that we need to know? They want to know all of this more than editors believe. And a number of studies were done to determine really what kinds of issues does the public really want, but is not being given to them in the news coverage. They're interested in curriculum and instruction. They're also interested in finance, maybe not as much, but they really want to know all of this stuff. Again, more than editors realize. Gallup, as you might know, the product, the Gallup poll, a number of polls have been done about this, but really readers just want to know more about education than what is provided in the news. So if the public wants more education news, then really why are we not supplying that? That's really a big concern that we're seeing. And also the literature review over time has shown us that there are four main issues. We're talking about trying to improve education news reporting. Really, what have been those trends? So historically, one problem is that there is a severely limited coverage of news. Again, it's because we don't cover education in the way that we should. We're focusing maybe too much on one thing and not enough on a number of things. A second problem is that we do have an unbalanced education coverage. Again, in that we are covering something a little too much. Maybe we are focusing more on school buildings, or maybe we are focusing too much on a particular issue and not enough on another. So we're not seeing a good balance of that. The third problem is that really we just have education reporters who have not been really educated on this beat. So news organizations really need to do a better job of educating its journalists before sending them off to cover a school board meeting, before covering anything going on in the classrooms. They really need to have, I think, a love and a passion for all the neat things that does happen in education, but also the understanding and the firm footing to want to get to the bottom of issues as well. And then the fourth main problem that we see in education news reporting, again, historically over time, is that there's a greater emphasis on events rather than issues. We tend to see news about schools when bad things happen. Likewise, we tend to see news about schools when good things happen, but we're not discovering what's really in the middle, the issues that kind of make education tick. So that's what we need to really focus more on. So I'm going to stop there. But as you can see, there are a lot of holes in the education news history, and there's a lot of work to do. So I'm looking forward for you being part of this journey to see how you can help fill in those gaps and help to tell the stories that are so rich and prominent in education news. Thank you for listening.